Good evening, listeners, and thank you for joining us for episode 6 of season 2 of the Can You Fix Nigeria Challenge. Um, season 2, with season 2, we're still continuing with our discussions on the energy sector. And tonight, my guest is Ms. Adeola Sunmola. She's a partner at the Udo Udoma Belu Osagi Partnership, international law firm in Nigeria. She's a partner in the Power Projects and Infrastructure Division. Adeola, it's good to have you on the show. Talk tonight.
It's good to be back, Kune. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's always great to have you on some of our discussions. Let me get right into it tonight. You know, a lot of times we talk about renewables, we talk about climate change and things like this. I sense that a lot of our listeners back home don't actually understand what we mean when we talk about renewables. Can you shed a bit of light for us on what we mean when we talk about renewables generally?
Of course. Renewable energy is essentially a term that describes energy sources that are derived directly or indirectly from natural sources.
Okay.
And these natural sources are sources that are replenished at a higher rate than they are consumed. So examples would be sunlight and wind, and other sources that are constantly being replenished, such as hydropower. These energy sources are somewhat infinite, unlike traditional fossil fuels.
Hmm.
And traditional fossil fuels, as you know, are coal, oil, and oil and gas.
Hmm.
And these sources are, i.e., these non-renewable sources are finite in nature. But that's not the case with renewable energy sources. Renewable energy sources are pretty much infinite. Examples of renewable energy sources include solar energy, wind, biomass, hydropower, and hydrogen.
Okay. Wow. Interesting. Interesting. Thank you for that. I think the key for me there was the operational word, whether they are finite or infinite. I think that's very key. It's a very key definition there, whether they're finite
Yes,
or non-finite.
absolutely. For example, in the case of solar energy, the technology that's used to produce energy or electricity from that source is the one that involves the utilization of the sun.
Hmm.
And when the sun is utilized to produce electricity or energy directly for generation purposes,
Okay.
then that energy can be used for industrial processes or even transportation.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Okay. So,
And because of the large size of the solar resource, you know, it's
hmm.
large, it's
Yeah,
infinite
it's
because of the
infinite.
nature. It's infinite
Hmm.
because of the nature of the solar resource. The technologies that are used to generate electricity from this source isn't constrained by feedstock
Okay. Okay.
requirement, but
Okay.
rather by costs and things such as institutional obstacles, such
Hmm.
as the performance of the technology infrastructure
I
that's
see.
associated with it.
I see. But you know what interests me. So let me bring this now to the context of the Nigerian market in particular. So I recall that under President Buhari, right, there was this so-called Nigeria Climate Change Act, which was being supervised by the Ministry of Environment. But I'm not very familiar with what this covers for us. Can you share with us what the objective of that act was in Nigeria and how we are actioning that? How is Nigeria actioning?
Of course. Coincidentally, Kule, today is the second anniversary of that law.
Oh, look at that.
Yes, what a coincidence. It
It's a
became the
big coincidence.
climate, that it is. The law is called the Climate Change Act,
Okay.
and it took effect on 18th of November 2021. The main objective of this statute is to protect Nigeria's environmental ecosystem and to reduce the country's greenhouse gas emissions. I'm sure many people are aware about the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
and that was signed by several countries, including Nigeria.
Yeah.
Following the signatory to the Paris Agreement, then various countries they decide to take steps towards realizing, yes, they decided to take steps towards realizing the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and also to see how they can reduce their carbon footprints,
Okay.
how they can encourage institutions and government establishments to reduce their footprints, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Missions.
In terms of in terms of the Nigerian Climate Change Act, it applies to ministries, departments, and agencies, which are, for the purpose of this conversation, I beg your pardon, MDAs.
Okay.
But it also not just applies to MDAs, it also applies to public and private entities in Nigeria. And there are a few highlights of that law that I would share. The first is that the Climate Change Act establishes the National Council on Climate Change. This council is vested with the power to develop policies and make decisions on all matters that relate to climate change in Nigeria. The council manages the implementation of the provisions of the Climate Change Act, and he administers the Climate Change Fund, which I'll talk about in a bit.
Okay.
One of the key highlights of the Climate Change Act and of the role of the council is that the act requires the council to collaborate with the Federal Inland Revenue Service to develop a mechanism for imposing a carbon tax.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So we have a
Yes.
carbon tax in Nigeria?
Not quite yet, but
Okay.
it's being considered.
I see.
So the main aim, carbon taxes are environmental taxes that are levied on precise units of carbon by government in order to reduce carbon emissions, high emissions through fossil fuel-based energy that occur as a result of the production or consumption of goods and services. And the reasoning behind imposing carbon tax is that because economic agents such as companies, households, etc., generate carbon emissions, then they should be responsible for bearing the economic cost that's associated with those emissions, rather than pass on the cost of the pollution to the society.
I
That's the
see.
reasoning
I
behind it,
see.
yes.
I see.
So going back to the council established under the Climate Change Act, the council is required to collaborate with the Federal Inland Revenue Service to develop a mechanism for imposing carbon tax, and to coordinate the implementation of sectoral targets and guidelines for the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other causes of climate change.
I see. I see.
The membership of the council is broad. It includes members of various ministries and agencies, and then there is also an encouragement to include other members from representatives of women, youth, and persons with disabilities, which is quite impressive. Yeah.
Okay.
Now,
Let
sure.
me let me bring you back though. You know, one of the things you said as you were going through and you were telling us this thing was that you talked about that Paris thing, right? And then you talked about the practical steps that people were taking, you know, from country to country, what they needed to do. So let me give you an example. What I know now is that most IOCs or international oil companies, they are changing from saying I'm a petroleum or oil and gas company. I'm becoming an energy company. You see what I mean? So the old Total is now Total Energy. The old
Yes.
British Petroleum or BP has gone to Beyond Petroleum. Qatar Energy has become Qatar Energies, those kind of things.
Yes.
So in Nigeria, are there practical things like that that we also see where companies are changing their strategy to be able to say, look, we're going in this direction of renewables and we're taking this climate act very seriously? Are there practical examples from Nigeria?
Yes, I think the first example is that people are ditching the terminology oil and gas for energy.
Oh, okay.
Yes, even where they're referring to oil and gas, the terminology is changing increasingly
Okay,
to
it's a good
energy.
step. It's a good first
It
step, isn't
is.
it? Oh,
I think it is. I think it is. But in addition to that, we're also seeing institutions that are beginning to establish policies and products
hmm,
and subsidiaries that have the objective of pushing their climate-oriented ambitions.
hmm.
Some of the notable examples would include those by even some indigenous um, energy companies. I don't call them oil and gas companies, even some indigenous energy companies, such as Ohando, which has now established a renewable energy subsidiary that's called Ohando Clean Energy Limited,
Oh, okay.
which has an agenda of investing in climate friendly and bankable energy solutions across the African continent.
Hmm.
You've already shared the example of Total, but Total is also another institution that has rebranded itself by calling itself Total Energies, and has made a clear indication of its commitment to utilize cleaner and more sustainable energy exploration measures.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, a few
Let me,
years ago,
yeah, please
a
go
few
ahead.
years ago, a few years ago, I recall that Total issued an announcement that it would invest about approximately $60 billion in clean energy product.
Ah.
The final example I would like to share is that relating to Shell. Shell also has a commitment towards climate inclined investment.
Hmm.
And Shell's recent acquisition of Daystar Energy, which is a renewable, which is one of the fastest growing renewable and solar energy companies in Africa,
Okay.
I think is an indication of where Shell is headed in
And,
terms of where it sees its renewable energy footprint. Yeah, so some of those are the examples.
fantastic. Fantastic. Please let me ask you another question then. Another question that comes to my mind usually about this. So if you look at EU, for example, the EU has an example as saying that maybe by 2030, they will ban the use or the production of internal combustion engines using fossil fuels. So our cars will no longer come to us using petrol or diesel. They will be going solar or battery or whatever in EU. Now, I know that recently some have pushed that target from 2030 back to about 2035. Okay, but how does that affect us in Africa, in your opinion? And what are the realistic timelines that we as Africans should prepare for in terms of the switchover, of the final switchovers? In your opinion,
Yeah,
that is. Yeah.
yeah, I think that my opinion on this would be that, Africa's story has to be different from that of the rest of the world,
Hmm.
right?
Agreed.
Because Africa has it has natural resources
Hmm.
that are not always climate friendly.
Okay.
But it does also have gas reserves that can be utilized for climate friendly renewable energy sources.
Okay.
So I think that Africa's playbook should be different in terms of what the continent has to do in terms of industrialization
I see.
and bringing its population out of poverty because of these natural resources that it has. And whilst it's important to know that these that the that reducing greenhouse gas emissions need to be at the front burner, At the same time, I don't think Africa should be told to overlook these resources. I think there has to be a way to ensure that technology is utilized and there are appropriate means of ensuring that these resources that Africa has are utilized for the development of its population, for the industrialization of the continent, and most importantly, for bringing its people out of poverty. So I don't see Africa's story tied to a number. I'm not saying being tied to a date. I beg your pardon. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be an ambition in terms of when these when these policies will take effect, or the date that he has for all of these goals. But I think that we do need to bear in mind that Africa's industrialization has to come first.
To be honest, I agree with you on what you're saying completely. I remember I listened to the CEO of Qatar Energy at Gastech 2022, and he was speaking in Dubai, and he was saying, look, the timelines for Africa and Asia should be a bit different because we still have over 1 billion people who don't have electricity. The first thing will be that we should be able to bring those people out of poverty first before we start thinking about other options. So we cannot be on the same timeline with the EU. I agree. I understand what you're saying there, and I agree with you totally.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not as if it's not as if many countries on the continent don't have a date in mind. For example, in Nigeria, Nigeria's ambition is to achieve net zero by 2060.
2060, did you say?
Yes.
Okay.
2060.
Okay.
So yes, those ambitions are there, but we also do have to bear in mind that the development of the continent is to be paramount.
It is to be prioritized. Fantastic, fantastic, Gela. All right. Now, but let me ask you another question. Another thing that always pricks my mind a bit about this. So you can see now that people in Europe, in the Americas, they are switching to EV cars and things like that. In the UK, which I'm a bit familiar with, what I see is that they are now making, the main issue was about infrastructure. So if you switch to electric cars, how can you charge those electric cars? I think this is a question that a lot of people have also asked, that how can we get this infrastructure in as quickly as possible to be able to support some of these goals that we're talking about. So Europe 2035, Nigeria 2060, what can we do about bringing infrastructure in place to support this transition to renewable sources? Yes, in your view.
Yeah, I think that first would be for many institutions to begin to think about how to accelerate policies that are aimed at finding solutions and also financing the solutions. Because without the appropriate capital, we'll continue to go round and round in circles and just continue to talk about the subject. The global trend towards renewable energy has impacted both economic and regulatory landscapes, as you can imagine. And whilst the transition is a critical point, it has to be carefully undertaken in terms of the amount of infrastructure. So top on my list would be firstly, providing incentives for these solutions. The government needs to consider a framework that includes that's similar to what's currently contained under the Income Tax Relief Act, which provides tax incentives to businesses that are providing a model that's different and technology that's new. I think with the sufficient amount of incentives, then there will be investments in infrastructure that's required to leapfrog renewable energy in Nigeria.
Nigeria.
I can talk about the others when we talk about, what Nigeria needs to do as a
Okay.
country.
All right. Thank you. I'll come to that actually in a minute because the
Mm.
next question then I was going to ask you. I mean, I guess you'll be familiar with President Tinubu recently coming in and they're talking about these 3,000 CNG buses and things like that. So some of those kind of things are in the play. Here, I'm familiar that a few countries have rolled out this kind of CNG buses, particularly in the Middle East in the last few years. But one thing that always goes with that is the infrastructure, like CNG stations and things like that. I don't think we have those yet. So my question to you is, when President Tinubu talks to us about these 3,000 CNG buses, is that from a cost economic standpoint facing the oil subsidy issue, or is he from the climate angle? It's not very clear to me.
It's
Where
both.
it's both. Ah,
It's
okay,
both. It's both.
okay, okay.
The idea behind the rollout of compressed natural gas vehicles
Yes.
is to supply vehicles that consume alternative,
Okay.
cheaper fuel rather than the conventional petrol and diesel fuel sources, right?
Okay.
And the need to switch from petrol to gas it's been further necessitated by the recent deregulation of the petroleum sector and the removal of subsidies on pump prices by the Nigerian government, which has essentially led to the increase in domestic pump prices. So this presidential initiative seeks to achieve both a cost reduction alternative as well as to support Nigeria in meeting its climate ambitions. As you know, there is unpredictability in the petrol market, and sometimes there's scarcity of petrol, even though that hasn't been the case in recent times. Since subsidy has been removed,
Removed.
that has it used to be the case that there was scarcity, and during during those times, petrol will usually be sold at high prices. Makes it difficult for
Hmm.
Nigerians to cope. And as you know, increase in fuel prices affect other indices of inflation,
Absolutely.
right? And so the initiative to roll out these CNG powered vehicles is both cost linked and environmentally linked, because these types of vehicles will reduce CO2 emissions
Returns. Okay.
when they are compared to other vehicles that utilize PMS or diesel, right? Additionally, these buses have lower noise pollution impact,
Okay.
and so when users use these, then it achieves the two objectives
Two
of reducing
objectives.
cost and enabling and providing a blueprint for Nigeria to move ahead with its climate ambitions.
Thank you very much. I think I've
Sure.
got two more questions for you, but I'll try and go through them fairly quickly. So one of the first things first, okay, if you were in the position of authority now to help us to articulate where we should be going with this renewable thing, what, in your opinion, do you think that Nigeria should be doing now?
Okay, there are a couple of things.
Yeah.
First, firstly, I would say that Nigeria needs to harmonize all of its um, white paper, regulations, laws, etc.,
Hmm.
renewable energy. Because sometimes, streamlining all of these things, all of these initiatives can help with coordination and implementation.
Okay.
And at this stage, implementation is key, right? So if all of those initiatives are harmonized, then it's easier. And when I talk about initiatives, I'm talking about the National Energy Master Plan, the National Biofuel Policy, the Renewable Energy Master Plan, amongst others. There are many.
Yeah, very.
So they are many, and when if they are harmonized, then it's easier, even for investors to understand what they have to deal with.
mm, mm.
Apart from that, I think the next and possibly most important thing would be in relation to incentives, which I've already discussed,
Mm.
um, especially tax incentives um, for investors in the renewable energy sector. The next related issue would be addressing illiquidity challenges currently in Nigeria. We have dollar illiquidity challenges.
Absolutely.
And so what happens? What happens is that many investors that invest foreign currency denominated loans in Nigeria, or even make equity investments in projects, infrastructure projects, in renewable energy projects, they are finding it harder to um, convert the of their investment into foreign currency and to repatriate
Repatriate their
these.
money. I
Yes.
see. I see.
And this is a big challenge because I mean it goes to bankability, right?
Mm,
It's a bankability issue, and if this issue is not addressed, um, foreign investors particularly will continue to be reluctant about
mm,
Nigeria. And Nigeria is such a critical country for the continent
mm.
that we can't afford foreign investors to be cautious about Nigeria.
Okay, I see.
We have the population, we have the resources, we have human capital development,
Mm,
and we just have to ensure that the other pieces are put together well to provide comfort to investors that this challenge that has been on for a couple of years now, but that has also increased since COVID,
mm.
that there is a lasting solution to this challenge.
I
And I
see.
may not have all the answers, but
Yeah,
it
yeah.
may, one of the solutions could include Nigeria developing a framework for the availability of hedging instruments, such
Okay,
as cross-currency swap.
I
Some of
see.
these are available products, um, but in terms of implementation, there are still risks, right? So these hedging instruments, including cross-currency swaps, will mitigate the current foreign exchange and dollar convertibility risks.
Convertibility. I see. I
Yeah.
see. I'll ask you, let me ask you another question. Let me take this another way now and ask you
Mm.
a second question, a follow-up question to that. So when we started this discussion, you gave us examples of what renewables are, like hydro, you mentioned biomass, you mentioned wind, you mentioned solar. I know that we, as a country, we have some experience with hydro. We've done some work with hydro. We have some good hydro experience.
We do.
I'm not too sure about the other ones. So but from where we are, I don't know whether we have a lot of wind heads with us. I don't know whether we have expertise in biomass. So, in your opinion, where do we have the best competitive advantage that we should be putting our efforts and our money into? Because I sense because we don't have a lot of money, we cannot be into everything, right? So, in your
Mm.
opinion, where should we be going first?
So you're right. Capital continues to be a challenge.
Hmm.
But I think top of the list in terms of renewable energy sources would be solar for
Okay.
obvious reasons. Yes, for obvious reasons. The resource is available. The northern part of the country, and everywhere actually, not just the north, but the resource is available, and early investors have been able to understand the sector, but we need more. So I'll describe the kinds of um, renewable energy investments we're seeing on the
Okay.
basis of solar from two perspectives.
Okay.
One is the one that's associated with the development of mini grids, right? And the second would be other large scale solar projects. In terms of mini grids, I think we've relatively got it right in Nigeria.
Oh, okay.
We've relatively got it right. We have, the Renewable Energy Agency is doing great work. We have a lot of institutions that are providing capital for the establishment and construction of mini grids across Nigeria. And there have been many success stories. Some of these mini grid-like projects are also being developed on what is referred to as a C and I basis, commercial and industrial solar energy for businesses, for manufacturing institutions, for manufacturing companies to utilize in place of generators and diesel based alternatives. So we've relatively gotten that right in terms of the nature, in terms of the technology, and in terms of the nature of the development. I think it's large scale utility solar projects that's where we have some work to do, and we have some work to do in terms of the bankability issues. There's still bankability issues. Investors are saying that the tariff isn't cost reflective. Several years ago, there were many PPAs. PPA is referred to as power purchase agreements. Power purchase agreements that were executed by several sponsors with a view to developing these solar-based IPPs. But these projects have not yet come to light. And I'm talking about projects that have a capacity of 500 megawatts above. We need these large-scale utility projects to come to light. And some of the things, it's what's holding these projects back are some of the bankability issues that I've discussed. So the tariff and the currency risk that's we're currently experiencing in the sector are the key challenges.
Adeola, I'm running out of time. Let me put one last question to you. Recently, I heard that Nigeria discovered that we also have some lithium in Nigeria. And this can become very helpful for us in building a battery industry. Is that good news? Have we heard anything like this? And how's the sector warming up to that?
It is good news, but there is a lot of work to be done in the mining sector, because this is the mining side of things. Absolutely. And the work has to be done from a regulatory standpoint, right? So the issue with the mining sector hasn't been lack of laws or lack of regulations, but enforcement, right? So where these resources are being found, the so-called investors prefer not to be regulated.
Not to go there.
And they prefer not to be regulated.
Oh, not to be regulated.
They do not want to be regulated, and that's just not acceptable.
No, that's not acceptable.
Yes.
That's
so I think I think that it's enforcement that has to be prioritized.
It's great to speak with you. The time runs away from me so quickly anytime I'm having these discussions, but I really do apologize. I have to take a break from it for today. Thank you again for being with us tonight, and I'm sure that I will come back to you before we finish this round of series on this Can We Fix Nigeria challenge again. Thank you, Ms. Adeola, for being with us tonight.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.